Emmy Award-winning and sports broadcasting Hall of Famer Bob Costas joining the Alex Feuz Show this morning on Power 88, broadcasting live from Dean College. Bob, you are a devoted baseball fan, and you have a love for the game, specifically the heroic era. Why does this game of baseball mean so much to you?
Well, I think, first of all, Alex, any era could be heroic. There are heroic things going on now in baseball. There are as many good players populating Major League Baseball now than at any time. But I think all of us have an affinity for, whether it's sports, music, a lot of different cultural experiences. We have a greater affinity for the things that we first latched onto when we were young. And so as it happened, I first became aware of baseball in the late 50s and through the 60s. And that was a period of time where games were on television, yes, but you didn't have the saturation of coverage of all sports coming from every direction. Basic television, cable television, the internet, talk radio. So there's a little bit more distance, a little more left to the imagination, a little bit more romance involved, and much of the broadcasting came to you through radio, which really is the theater of the mind. So it just so happens that when I was learning baseball and first becoming a fan, that was the era of Mickey Mantle and Willie Mays and Hank Aaron and others. And those are the players, and those are the moments and the seasons that resonate most with me on an emotional basis. But still, as a baseball fan now, many decades later, I still follow the game and still appreciate it.
You have spent over 45 years in the sports broadcasting and broadcasting industry. Specifically, this question would be geared toward the sport of baseball. Who would you consider one of the most underrated athletes in the game of baseball?
Underrated now or underrated ever?
Underrated ever.
Well, I think that from the era we were just discussing, my childhood or adolescence, the most underrated great player was Frank Robinson. He happened to be a contemporary of Mays and Mantle and Aaron, all of whom were probably a notch greater than Frank Robinson. But Robinson was a genuinely great player who hit nearly 600 lifetime home runs, was an MVP in both leagues, first with Cincinnati, then with Baltimore, was an outstanding postseason performer, was a leader on every team he was part of, and then, of course, went on to become the first African-American manager and managed two ball clubs, if you count the Expos and the Nats, along with the Cleveland Indians. So he's a very significant player historically, and I think he didn't get his due, not because he wasn't great, but because he was somewhat overshadowed by his contemporaries.
In this day and age, Bob, a lot of baseball fans have their wish lists and what they want to see implemented in Major League Baseball today. If you could put the commissioner hat on for one day, what would you implement to this league in today's world in baseball?
Well, one of the things that I would have implemented would have been part of my answer for years and years they finally got around to, which was eliminating the 40-man rosters in September, which was one of the dumbest rules in all of sports, playing pennant race games under conditions that are completely different from the bulk of the regular season and the postseason that will follow. So at least they rectified that finally going into next season. I think right now, overall, the biggest problem facing baseball is length of games and pace of play. And without getting too deeply into it, the problem is that what analytics tell front offices and managers in the dugout is the best way to go about getting a competitive edge and winning games. What analytics tell you to do is not the best thing from an entertainment standpoint. Parades of relief pitchers, launch angle, defensive shifts, velocity over pitching to contact, so fewer baseballs are in play during the course of the game. A higher percentage of outcomes are walks, strikeouts, or home runs. And of course, home runs are important. They have their place. They're exciting. But when they become too commonplace, their impact is reduced. I think one thing they could do when you talk about all this is I'm totally with a pitch clock with nobody on base. Get the ball, get back on the mound, get ready to pitch, and don't step out of the batter's box. You got hitters stepping out of the batter's box after not swinging. There's no contact. They step out between taking a pitch, readjust the elbow pad, the batting glove. Let's get it going. I don't know if that would solve all of it, but that's one thing that could be implemented.
You once said the National League in baseball is like chess, and the American League is like checkers. And this was more of the designated hitter in baseball. I feel like if my interpretation is correct in that aspect, would you ever want to see the DH travel into the National League?
I like it the way it is. I like it with different rules in each league. I realize there's a concern, especially among American League teams, with interleague play in National League parks, and then you have pitchers not only not accustomed to batting, but perhaps greater risk running the bases, and there have been some injuries. So I recognize that as a concern, but I think the contrast between the two leagues and the difference in strategy actually is interesting and makes for good conversation among baseball fans.
I'll read through the resume quickly. Primetime host of 11 Olympic Games from 1992 to 2016. You've called Major League Baseball games, NASCAR, NFL, golf, boxing, hosting talk shows. Is there anything left still on that bucket list?
Well, when you start ticking off things like NASCAR, where I once interviewed Dale Earnhardt for 5 minutes, and that's my sole contribution to Dale Earnhardt Jr., my sole contribution to NASCAR coverage, that's sort of padding the resume a little bit. There isn't much that I haven't done that I'm yearning to do, but there are a few things that I still enjoy doing more than others: baseball play-by-play, long-form interviews, programs that allow for a little bit of journalism and commentary that I would be willing to return to. It's not that I've never done it before, but I'd be willing to return to it if exactly the right circumstances came along.
If someone asked you, how would you define an interview, what would your response be?
Oh, it depends upon what the subject is. Some interviews are specifically news-oriented, and you cut right to the chase, and there are specific answers and lines of questioning that should be followed, answers you're looking for. And even if the interview subject is evasive and isn't forthcoming, it doesn't mean you shouldn't ask the questions. You get credit for at least putting the question on the record, and sometimes the response, be it truthful and forthcoming or be it evasive, says something to the audience. Then there are other kinds of interviews where you're looking to get anecdotes, it's more biographical, you're trying to engage the person in conversation. So the preparation and approach for that is somewhat different. And then it also differs depending on how much time you have. If you've only got 3 or 4 minutes in a certain format, then it's an entirely different thing than if you've got a little bit more time and you can be more expansive.
If you could host a talk show with anyone, dead or alive, who would you want to host a talk show with?
Well, dead or alive, I think almost anybody would want to speak with Abraham Lincoln, let's say. Go through a long list of historical figures. More recently, he's passed away several years ago, but J.D. Salinger, who wrote The Catcher in the Rye, is an important figure for many of us of a certain generation. I believe it's still pretty much standard reading in high schools, and yet he was a complete recluse for most of his life, and nobody ever got to speak with him on the record at all. It was sort of like Captain Ahab going after Moby Dick. It was a long-time quest, and nobody ever really tracked him down, but that would be one. You know, Sandy Koufax, if we're just talking about baseball, Sandy Koufax is widely admired, and rightly so, and he's one of the most gracious people. You'll never get turned down more politely than when you're turned down by Sandy Koufax, but he guards his privacy. So if someone could get Sandy Koufax to sit and speak about his career, I think that would be tremendously interesting to baseball fans of all ages. I have interviewed him, but kind of in a group situation with Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, and Johnny Bench when they were named the 4 greatest living players. And Sandy was willing to be interviewed in that situation because it wasn't all about him. That's just the way he is, and I think people respect that. I certainly do.
Bob, this is my favorite part of the show, Fast 5 Quick Round Answers. It's 5 quick questions, and you have as much time to answer them. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of music does Bob Costas listen to?
A fairly wide range, but again, going back to my very first answer, the music that grabs you when you're younger. So 60s and 70s rock and roll, but I also listen to a fair amount of jazz and R&B. Just about anything of quality. There's some show music that appeals to me. Cole Porter stuff appeals to me. There's some more recent stuff that appeals to me. It's a pretty wide swath. But if I was confined to one thing, it would probably be 50s, 60s, and 70s rock and roll.
One of your favorite sports movies?
There's a long list. I would say that Bull Durham is a really good combination of the romance of baseball without the overt hearts and flowers, but also an insider's look at some of the realities of minor league baseball, because Ron Shelton, the director, had played minor league ball in the Orioles system. On the other end, The Natural is an allegorical tale. It was in Bernard Malamud's book, and it is in Barry Levinson's movie. And when you look at the cast of The Natural and the cinematography and Randy Newman's score, for what it is, it's a different thing than Bull Durham set out to be, or that 8 Men Out set out to be. But for what it is on its own terms, it's a magnificent movie.
Biggest pet peeve?
I guess I have a lot of them, but one would be the abandonment of an ongoing commitment to truth and fairness in the media. The media has expanded so much. A lot of it is hyper-partisan, and so even if some of what you're getting is true, it's disproportionate, leaning in a different direction. There isn't a full context to it. And then with social media and all of its dynamics, you don't have people really checking. They're looking for hot takes. They're responding to something they've seen, and if what they've seen isn't entirely accurate, then they're commenting off something where the premise is incorrect to begin with, and by the time it spins out in its 95th iteration, you're pretty far from the truth. I don't know how we ever get that genie back in the bottle, but it isn't a matter of new media. It isn't a matter of technology, but what should be lasting principles, commitment to facts, fairness, context, I think a lot of that has been lost.
Go-to book?
Well, I don't know that there's any one.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there's any one go-to book. I think if you went to what a decent university would tell you is the canon of great literature, then you'd be fine.
What's one fun fact that maybe not a lot of people know about you? It's a tough one.
I would think that people who have paid attention over time, and maybe you have to be of a certain age to have taken a lot of this in, they would see that that I'm up for amusing and self-deprecating stuff. I used to do that all the time on David Letterman, on Conan O'Brien, on Jay Leno. I have fewer opportunities for that now, and younger people who only know my work over the last 10 years may only know a slice of it, but I think that over time it was pretty clear that I was willing to do a serious interview one day and then take a pie in the face the next day.
Would you ever consider stand-up?
No, not as an ongoing profession or as a label as a stand-up comedian. I think there's a big difference between someone who's a broadcaster who's capable of being funny in the right circumstances and somebody who's funny as their primary definition. But I've occasionally been on stages or been in situations where it was the rough equivalent of stand-up, and in a narrow context, I was pretty well able to hold my own.
Bob, last question for you. If a 15-year-old kid came up to you and told you that when he watches sports, he mutes the TV and doesn't get the art of broadcasting, what would you tell him?
He mutes the TV? Well, unless he's trying to be a broadcaster, in which case muting the TV is part of that process. He or she's free to do whatever they want, but I've always felt that broadcasting was an essential part of the sports experience. It's the soundtrack of the games. Now, obviously, there's a wide variation in quality across the broadcast spectrum, but if you listen to the best storytellers, the broadcasters with the best facility for language and the best understanding of a situation, difference between television and radio, difference working from one partner as opposed to another. If you listen to the best broadcasters, I think that enhances your experience. At least it always has mine.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Costas, for coming on the show today. I greatly appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to come on the show.
Thank you very much, Alex. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks a lot, Alex.